Adam, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Good day, everyone. It's not a good day in Turkey. There are times in history when long-term problems catch up with us and become short-term problems. And Turkey's present political crisis is motivated not simply by Islamist prejudice on the part of President Erdogan and his AKP party, and not simply by short-term considerations arising from the Syrian civil war and the rise of ISIS in Iraq, but really fundamental issues which affect the viability of Turkey as it's presently constituted. Let me start with the elections and the short-term issues, and then work backwards to the more basic problems. What occurred on November 1st, in the view of a number of observers whose judgment on this I take quite seriously, and is that Erdogan effectively stole the national elections. This was the view of Michael Rubin at the American Enterprise Institute. It's the view of Daniel Pipes at Middle East Forum, where I am a fellow, and it's the view of a large number of Turkish observers. It was pointed out that the results were announced 2 hours after the polls were closed, even though Turkey is entirely a paper ballot system, and it typically takes 24 hours to count the votes. Evidently, it wasn't necessary to take as much time to count the votes on November 1st because the result was known in advance. So the AKP party came out with a 49% vote total and an absolute majority in parliament at the expense of the Kurdish party and other opposition parties, an apparent triumph for Erdogan, but it was a triumph achieved in two ways. One was by outright ballot box stuffing. In Michael Rubin's estimate, the margin of votes that were simply stolen by Erdogan was about 5%, including phony ballots, dead people voting, and so forth. More important, though, than the ballot box stuffing was the totalitarian campaign of intimidation against opponents of the regime. Many Kurdish towns were effectively under siege. Dozens of journalists, bloggers, opposition figures were detained. On October 10th, we had the worst terrorism incident in Turkish history of the last 100 years since the Armenian massacres. The dual bombings at a pro-Kurdish rally in Ankara on October 10th, which was widely blamed on the government in some fashion or another. So the combination of outright theft and intimidation of voters is what gave Erdogan the majority. This will turn out to be a Pyrrhic victory for Erdogan. He's buying himself more problems in the long term than he can solve by stealing elections in the short term. And that's because, as I said, the Turkish state as it's presently constituted is really not viable in the long term, or in my view, or even the medium term. What's the problem in Turkey? There aren't enough Turks. There never have been. The Seljuk Turks who conquered Turkey from the Byzantines after Byzantium was catastrophically weakened by the Venetian-led invasion of 1300, took control of the Anatolian Peninsula and then conquered Constantinople, renamed to Istanbul, in 1453. The Anatolian Peninsula was always a shifting stage in which many different people marched across and stayed for a while and came and left. At present, the demographic issue in Turkey is one of the most pressing of any country in the world. The Kurds, who are the majority in the southeast, typically have about 3 children. Turks in the rest of the country typically have about 1.5. In other words, the fertility rate of Muslim, Turkish-speaking citizens of Anatolia is pretty much identical to that of Western Europe. The Kurds have an extremely high fertility rate. This is clear from the results of the 2012 census, which are now out. It's a trend which has not abated. This has been a source of extreme concern for the Turkish authorities, and particularly for Turkish nationalists for years. There's a huge literature on it. A couple of years ago, my friend Nicholas Eberstadt, a demographer at the American Enterprise Institute, spent a month in Ankara looking over these data on a contract for the U.S. government, interviewing Turkish demographers, going through the data, and he came to the conclusion that in 20 years, that is 2043, by any reasonable scenario, half of Turkish young people would come from homes where Kurdish was the first language. So half the soldiers going into recruitment in the Turkish army 20 years from now will be native Kurdish speakers. And this is a trend which is effectively baked in the cake. There's almost no way this can be changed. How could Turkey respond to this enormous change in its demographics? Kurds are now 20% of the Turkish population. They will be roughly half of Turkish young people less than one generation from now. There are several ways you can respond to that. One is by changing the ethnic character of Turkey and changing its constitution, making it more explicitly a multi-ethnic state. This is something which the Islamists will never agree to, because the sense of identity, the reason for being there of the Turkish Islamists, is to revive Turkey's central role in the region, what has been frequently called a neo-Ottoman foreign policy, and become the leader of the Islamic world, as the Turkish Caliphate indeed was the leader of the Islamic world before its collapse at the end of the First World War. That's what they're there to do. They will never agree to that. The old Kemalists, the secular Turkish nationalists who derive from the secular state created by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in the 1920s, will also never agree to it, because the concept of Turkishness, which Ataturk introduced in the secularization of the Turkish state, forbids the idea of recognizing national majorities. The idea is to force everyone into the Turkish mold. The war against Kurdish independence advocates, which began in 1984 and killed 40,000 people, was conducted overwhelmingly not by the Islamists, but by the secular Turkish military. The Islamists during the 2000s effectively clipped the wings of the Turkish military and established a new kind of power, but neither of these elements are prepared, as a matter of their self-conception and their identity as political parties, their vision of Turkey, neither of them is prepared to compromise with the Kurds. So in the absence of compromise, we have a policy of violence towards the Kurds. There are still several Kurdish cities in the southeast of Turkey under effective siege. They've been cut off. They don't have food. They don't have water. Dozens, if not hundreds of people are being killed. And all of this, in my view, is an ultimately futile response to a demographic trend which is inevitable, and to the inevitable development of a Kurdish state incorporating areas that now belong to Syria, Iraq, Iran, as well as Turkey. It's worth going back and discussing just a bit of Turkish history here very briefly. In the 50 years before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, Ottoman territories in Europe, particularly the Balkans, were lost one by one, and a huge diaspora of Ottoman refugees was forced out of Europe into the Anatolian Peninsula. Ataturk himself was born in Salonika, the main northern city in Greece. At the end of World War I, 20% of the population of the Anatolian Peninsula were Europeans, Muslim European Ottomans who had been forced out of their homes, mainly in the Balkans, by the collapse of Ottoman control in those areas. In other words, as the Bulgarians and Serbs and Macedonians and Greeks took back territories from the Ottomans, the Muslim population were forced out. So a fifth of Turkey at the end of World War I were Europeans. This was Ataturk's base, and it was because of the European population that had migrated to the Ottoman Peninsula. Ataturk was able to seize power against the caliphate and declare a secular government and suppress many aspects of the public practice of Islam, including headscarves, including the fez. He changed the Arabic language to a Roman language and introduced a program of modernization. At the same time, the Turkish nationalists, the secular nationalists who moved under Ataturk, conducted a general expulsion and, in many cases, massacre or genocide against Christians in Anatolia. At the beginning of World War I, 1/5 of the population of the Anatolian Peninsula were Christian, mainly Greek and Armenian. The Turkish secularists under Ataturk murdered about 500,000 Greeks and expelled 1.5 million to 2 million, and murdered 1.5 to 2 million Armenians. So that 10%, that 20% Christian population was either butchered or expelled, and a 20% quotient of the population was imported as European Muslims into Turkey. That was the great demographic change. That produced a secular government which was called White Turkish. White Turks simply mean European Turks who emigrated from Europe and resettled in the Anatolian Peninsula. The so-called Black Turks were the Anatolian backward, semi-literate Muslims who lived in the Anatolian Peninsula who had no access to power. And for 3 generations, the Turkish secular government was a White Turk government. The great change that occurred when Erdogan came back, as Erdogan himself has put it many times, is that the Black Turks, the Anatolian pious Muslims of the central Anatolian plain, took the country back from these Europeanized Ottoman occupiers who had created the secular government and reinstituted Turkish Islamism. But Turkey has never been a stable or well-founded entity at any point in its history of the past 100 years. Why are there so many Kurds in Turkey? Why are the Kurds the main ethnic problem on the part of the Turks? The reason the Kurds are there is because those southeastern provinces of Turkey, which are now majority Kurdish, used to be called Western Armenia. Ataturk brought the Kurds in to kill the Armenians, to drive them out, and they resettled and took Armenian territory. So what goes around comes around, and the solution to Turkey's Armenian problem has now become a separatist problem for Turkey, and the demographic clock is ticking like Captain Hook's alligator with the alarm clock, in a way that the Turks can't ignore, they can't stop, but will fight against viciously in the short term. So the immediate response of the Erdogan government to the self-assertion of the Kurds is to try to suppress them violently. What occurred in the June elections, when the Kurdish party for the first time tipped the 10% mark, which is the minimum threshold that a Turkish political party requires to enter parliament, is that the Kurds, for the first time, asserted themselves as a major force inside Turkish parliamentary politics, and that caused a panic on the part of the Erdogan's AKP. The response to that is what I just discussed. Turkey's response is to effectively ally with ISIS against the Kurds. This is occasioned by the fact that the Syrian civil war and the continued Iraqi civil war have left the Kurds in possession of a large amount of territory and on the cusp of creating an autonomous zone in Syria similar to the autonomous zone they have already created in northern Iraq, and eventually a state. And it's a state that almost certainly would have access to the sea. For to this is a teleconference, so we can't look at a map, but the strip of Kurdish-controlled land on the Syrian-Turkish border can extend itself to the sea. So this would be a Kurdish state with an outlet to the Mediterranean, eventually including parts of Iran, which are majority Kurdish, and presumably parts of southeastern Anatolia. The Turkish government's alliance with ISIS has been a matter of open scandal. Even the New York Times is scandalized by this. When the New York Times is scandalized by this, you know it really has to be something seriously unpleasant. On November 7th, for example, the Times ran a commentary entitled "Turkey's Troubling ISIS Game," which reports the collaboration of Turkey with ISIS both inside the country and in Syria in order to commit acts of violence against the Kurds and try to suppress them. This becomes extremely problematic because the United States is now openly arming the Kurds and giving them air support in order to suppress ISIS. The United States has finally, the Obama administration has finally been forced to ally with the Kurds because there really are very few moderate Syrian Islamists whom you can line up to fight ISIS, and the Kurds are by far the most effective fighting force. That is an alarming situation for the Turks because if the United States, their putative ally in NATO, is arming the Kurds, effectively they are sowing the seeds for a future Kurdish state. Turkey has also tried to maintain reasonably good relations with Russia, including on energy policy. Now, Turkey is in a proxy war with Russia because Russia is now attacking Syrian Islamists, ISIS, and who are also non-ISIS Islamists. The last meeting between Putin and Erdogan several weeks ago reportedly degenerated into a shouting match. And finally, Turkey is in very serious trouble with China. This has not really come out too much in the major press. Asia Times has published a number of stories about this. I happen to be in China with an Israeli group in September talking to Chinese counterterrorism people about their Uyghur problem. As you may know, there is a large Muslim majority in Western China called the Uyghurs, who are of Turkish descent. They speak a dialect of Turkish, and the Chinese are alarmed that Turkey is agitating for Uyghur independence, in other words, for the breakaway of Xinjiang province from China as an East Turkestan with support from the Turkish government. There are large numbers of Uyghurs now fighting with ISIS in Syria. They're being trained there. The Chinese are horrified that they might come back. They have the same concern that the Russians have indicated, that the great cauldron of terrorism in the Levant will become a training ground for terrorists who will return to their own countries, including China and Russia, and wreak havoc in their home countries. So the Chinese are observing with enormous concern an increase in skill level on the part of the terrorists, the commission of large terrorist actions, including ones with dozens of casualties at a time, by Uyghur independence people, with support from the Turks. So, although the Chinese don't talk a great deal about this in public, Chinese-Turkish relations are extremely strained at the moment. So, at this point, Turkey, after having a foreign policy whose slogan was "no enemies," ends up with no friends, with the possible exception of Saudi Arabia. Turkey, if I can shift topic just for a second, though this is related, Erdogan is not simply an Islamist ideologue. It's my belief that the natural constituency for radical Islam in Turkey is not sufficient to build the kind of support Erdogan needs to run a dictatorship. The other side of Erdogan is conventional third world economic populism. In other words, like any Latin American dictator or dictators in many parts of the world, Erdogan has run a debt bubble in Turkey in order to hand out enormous amounts of goodies to people, and that's been a major part of his political success. So just in the last 5 years, between 2010 and the present, Turkey has increased its foreign debt by from about $250 billion to about $400 billion. And most important, it's running a current account deficit of about 8% of GDP per year. In other words, its GDP is about $1 trillion US dollars, requires the net import of about $80 billion worth of goods. So it has to increase its debt by $80 billion a year to finance this enormous discrepancy between imports and exports. The reason they have such a big current account deficit, typical of populist third world dictatorships, is because Erdogan has ordered the Turkish banking system to make vast amounts of loans to Turkish consumers and businesses. The loans are growing at credit's growing at something like 30% a year in Turkey. The Turkish economy cannot meet the demand that's being created for political reasons, so that demand turns into demand for foreign goods and increases the debt. Now, given the fact that Turkey has alienated everyone in the region, how is it able to keep borrowing that much money? And the answer is the Gulf states. Given the fact that we are in the middle of a Shia-Sunni war across the Levant, and Turkey is a Sunni power and has, in the region, the largest Sunni army, and next to Pakistan, the most powerful Sunni army, the Sunni Gulf states are continuing to finance Turkey in order to maintain it as a bulwark against the Shia. The Saudis are also not particularly squeamish about support for ISIS and other Islamic extremists as long as they see them directed against the Iranians. So in an ISIS-Iranian war, you can expect the Saudis to support ISIS because anything that will kill Iranians is fine with them. So Turkey remains on a financial leash from Saudi Arabia. Erdogan is still able to finance himself, even though his economy is stalling, even though the Turkish currency has weakened enormously and is under a great deal of strain. It hasn't quite cracked yet. So what we're likely to have for the next several months is a continued war of attrition, with Turkey supporting Islamists in northern Syria and suppressing its own Kurds, committing despicable acts of violence against its own civilians. The Turkish debt bubble, as fragile as it may be, is probably not going to pop in the short term because the Gulf states will not let it pop. Erdogan is doubling down on everything he's done. One of his key electoral planks in the November 1st elections was to increase the minimum wage by 30%. His central bank and most economists in Turkey pointed out that he already has 10% inflation and already has a huge expansion of internal debt. So it's probably a very bad time to have a 30% increase in the minimum wage. But Erdogan is using such measures in typical populist fashion to try to gain support. All of these things have a fairly short time fuse. You can't run yourself into debt and commit atrocities against a growing part of your population indefinitely. But given the fact that Erdogan pulled off the vote fraud on November 1st, no one called him on it, and he's still getting money from the Gulf states, I don't believe this is going to snap in the short run. It's more of a 1 to 2 year time horizon before something really goes haywire, either economically or politically, inside the Turkish state. Now, let me switch gears for a moment to Egypt, as Adam requested. Egypt is a terribly poor country. Half of its population lives on less than $2 a day. But it's interesting that in all the discussion of Muslim refugees in Europe, you hear nothing about Egyptians. There are no Egyptians fleeing Egypt. On the contrary, you have millions of Egyptians working outside Egypt, many of them in the Gulf countries, many of them in Europe and elsewhere. And the reason that Egypt is afloat economically is because Egyptians are sending more than $20 billion a year back to Egypt in the form of remittances. In other words, they believe in their country, they're supporting their families, they may be working abroad, but they're working and they're sending their money home. That's what's keeping Egypt afloat, and that's a measure of the cohesiveness of Egypt. Egypt, of course, has an economic crisis, has been an economic crisis for years. It's a country that used to be the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. It now imports more than half its food. It has a vast increment of imports over exports. It's importing roughly $30 billion a year more than it exports, which is a grave and worrying situation. The reason it doesn't go bankrupt is because while it has a $30 billion trade deficit on one hand, it's getting more than $20 billion a year from remittances, and it's getting about $10 billion of aid from the Gulf states. The Gulf states will continue to support Egypt because Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are well aware that if Egypt were to collapse, if you were to have another Libya in Egypt or another Syria, the consequences for the Arab world would be so catastrophic that almost anything is worth doing rather than having that. So Egypt, in my view, has the ability to keep muddling through economically due to the loyalty of its population working abroad, sending money home, and due to the interest of the Gulf states in avoiding state failure in Egypt. Since General al-Sisi took over from the Muslim Brotherhood government of Mohammed Morsi in the summer of 2013, you've had at least some modest improvements. There are no food shortages. The electricity and natural gas shortages have largely been corrected. A great deal more power has been brought online. So although Egypt is still in a very bad economic situation, the sense of imminent catastrophe, of power failure, of food shortages, and so forth that we had in July of 2013 when the Muslim Brotherhood was running things, those to some extent have been ameliorated. That leaves General al-Sisi fighting a dirty war against a very significant Islamist majority, which is willing to do spectacular things to undermine the military government. And this has included, of course, the bomb that took down the Russian airliner a couple of weeks ago, numerous assassinations of public officials, attacks on Egyptian soldiers, particularly in the Sinai. It's a very nasty, large-scale, low-intensity civil war. I've seen a good deal of complaints on the part of people like Warren Kessler at the National Interest or Max Boot at Commentary, wringing hands over the nasty methods that the Egyptian government is using to suppress the Islamists. Egypt is a country where, sadly, nasty methods or no methods are going to work. It's a country where roughly 50% of people are functionally illiterate, 90% of women are genitally mutilated, 40% of people marry cousins. It is a backward tribal society with a very narrow stratum of Western-style educated elite on top and a very large and powerful Islamist movement. The idea that one can apply the niceties of policing that would apply to a Western country in Egypt and have human rights lawyers follow everyone around and make sure that nasty things aren't done to people is, in my view, just an illusion. Egypt is in the front line against Islamists who are willing to murder large numbers of civilians and are very dangerous. And to beat the Islamists means a prolonged, dirty war of attrition, like the French in Algeria. Important to remember, when the French tried to suppress the FLN in Algeria with the widespread use of torture and bombings of civilian villages and all kinds of other really nasty things, they won. The methods worked perfectly well, but the French public was too horrified by what the French army had done in Algeria to support it and revolted against it. But militarily, the French army won on the ground. Fortunately, it's the Egyptian public and not the French or another European or the American public which will judge what al-Sisi is doing. We may not like this, it may be deplorable, but we're talking a part of the world where the same standards we like may not apply. So a dictator like al-Sisi is infinitely preferable to the terrorists of the Muslim Brotherhood. There has been in the American political establishment a certain desire for social experimentation with the Muslim Brotherhood. I spoke a few months ago to Michael Hayden, who was director of CIA and before that director of NSA, who told me, we were not happy when Sisi threw the Muslim Brotherhood out in July 2013 because we wanted to see what would happen if the Muslim Brotherhood stayed in power and had to deal with things like garbage disposal and social services. Could they evolve into a more responsible social force? I told General Hayden, when Sisi kicked Mohammed Morsi out of office, with more than half of the adult population of Egypt in the streets demanding that he do so, there was less than a month's worth of wheat on hand in stockpiles in a country where half the population lives off subsidized bread. People were in danger of starving. General Hayden said, well, I guess that experiment might have been tough on the ordinary Egyptian. This kind of cavalier attitude towards the fate of countries whose decline and chaotic evolution would have terrible consequences for us, and is, in my view, irresponsible and elitist. I'm for giving General Sisi all the backing he needs to deal with the Islamists. I don't particularly want to know in detail how he does it, but I simply want him to get it done. So I think Egypt has reasonably good prospects for muddling through, although it will be extremely difficult. The best thing the United States could do would be to give Sisi the backing he requires to get the job done. I think what will probably happen is that China will become the major economic investor in Egypt, and China, of course, has no particular compunction about human rights violations. And if the United States doesn't assert itself in Egypt, then Egypt will gravitate ultimately into the orbit of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, China and Russia, and will be a minor player in the region. My view is we have two countries in the region which are traditional and reliable American allies that count. One is Israel, the other is Egypt. Israel, of course, much closer to us in many ways, but Egypt still wishing to be an American ally and critical to us. So American policy should be founded on strong support for our allies of a kind that makes the world understand that we back our allies as a counterweight to the incursions of Russia into the region.
David, you talked about both Egypt and Turkey, and both two things that they have, or a thing that they have in common, is they're both getting a lot of money from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. So my question to you is, how long can Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the other states continue to float these countries while oil isn't doing so well and they have to spend money on invading, let's say, Yemen and all sorts of other things that they're spending money on?
The answer is less than 5 years at current rates. According to the International Monetary Fund, Saudi Arabia can sustain its current rate of spending for 5 years and then no more. Saudi Arabia is a rich country with a lot of poor people. The estimates are that between a third and 40% of Saudis are actually quite poor. So the Saudi regime, which is a family-owned business, has justified its family ownership of the property by being paternalistic and handing out a lot of money to people who were otherwise quite poor. At such point that the Saudi royal family can no longer act like Santa Claus, or whatever the Muslim equivalent of Santa Claus might be, it becomes politically extremely vulnerable. The Muslim Brotherhood, or the Islamist argument against the Saudi royal family, is that they're a bunch of feckless and corrupt and incompetent, semi-westernized looters who simply take the money for themselves, don't care about the country, aren't really authentic representatives of Islam. And wouldn't it be better to have a totalitarian vanguard Islamist party on the lines of the Muslim Brotherhood or ISIS to replace them? What do you need a royal family for? To Saudis who are not part of the few thousand group that benefits from the Saudi monarchy, this is an attractive argument. So Saudi Arabia can't go on indefinitely. Certainly one of the dangers for Egypt is that the Saudis would run out of money and be unable to continue the subsidy. However, if you look at the numbers, it's the Egyptian people working abroad who are bailing out Egypt. The $30 billion shortfall they have in foreign trade is covered to the extent of 2/3 by remittances. 1/3 is covered by a subsidy from the Gulf states. So there is a way to find $10 billion elsewhere, from the West, from China, from other places, to replace the Saudis. I don't like the idea that the Egyptian government is dependent on the Gulf states. I think there are many things that could be done in terms of economic development and efficiency by the United States and by others, which would help get them out of this dependency relationship. It's sloth and inattention on the part of the United States and the West which causes this dependency, which, as you point out, is at considerable risk with oil prices so low.
What sort of lifespan do you give the government of al-Sisi?
Well, I think if al-Sisi can maintain the basic economic requirements, continue to meet them, I think it can last a very long time. Mubarak lasted for 30 years. There's no reason why al-Sisi could not last a considerably for a long time. He's fighting a very brutal war against a minority. I think the majority of Egyptians do not support the Islamists. I think the Islamists are using terrorist methods because they're an unpopular minority. They had their chance under Morsi. The vast majority of Egyptians turned against the Islamists. So I think al-Sisi can be a viable government for a considerable period of time, providing that the economic situation doesn't get out of his control. And the best thing that we can do is for Egyptian stability and for peace in the region is to make sure that we can't make sure because it's not our country, but do the best we can to make sure that the economic situation is not what blows him up. And if you look what the impact was of Libya going to pieces and how destabilizing that was for the entire region, for refugee problems and so forth, put a zero to the right of that if Egypt were to become destabilized. The consequences would be really staggering for everyone, and certainly for Israel, which has a functioning peace treaty. I have to hand it to al-Sisi. I mean, al-Sisi has done more to hurt Hamas than anyone else in the world, including any Israeli government. Digging the sea tunnels on the Gaza border and flooding the smuggling tunnels was a decisive action. The Hamas is aghast at what Egypt has done. He's hurt them very badly. He will continue to hurt them. And having an Arab government which is committed to suppressing Islamist terrorists like Hamas and their cousins inside Egypt is a huge asset to the West.
Once again, if people have questions, please send them to Deanne. I'll ask another question. You had mentioned earlier the Kurds, and they might eventually establish their own state. My question is more about the fact that they're so divided. There's the PKK in Turkey and in Syria. Then there's at least two groups in the KRG, and there's a separate group, I think, in Iran. Do you think that they will actually all unite eventually, or do you think they're more likely to have several Kurdish states?
I think they'll unite. The Syrian and Kurdish differences are more a matter of initials than content. Basically, it's all PKK. The Iranians are in a very different situation, and of course, they've had to operate under such secrecy and keep a such low profile that it's very difficult from the outside to evaluate them. I don't really care too much how that evolves. I think that the Kurds certainly deserve a state. I think it would be in the interest. I think they'll have it eventually. I think it's in the interest of the United States to help them to get there in the right way, but we don't need to force the process. Let them have whatever kind of state or states they please. It's really not our business to tell them how to move in that direction, but my sense is that Kurdish nationalism as an overriding umbrella factor is going to be much more important than the petty political differences.
Since you're a demographer, this is a great question for you. So the Turkish populations that have immigrated to Germany and other countries in Europe, do they have the same demographic problems that the Turks in Turkey have, or are they still producing a lot more children, which is causing problems in Europe?
Well, the Turks in general have the same demographic profile as Western Europeans. The Turks in Germany have slightly higher fertility rates than Germans, but the Germans are pretty good at corrupting immigrants, at least Turks. So there has been a considerable amount of Turkish assimilation into German habits. The Turks by themselves, in terms of their natural fecundity, have not represented any threat to German demographics up to the present. It's very different from the 1.5 million refugees who will probably pour into Germany over the next year. That does change German demographics, but overall, the Turkish immigrants have had similar fertility, only slightly higher fertility than the Germans, and it hasn't changed German demographics noticeably. It's not like the Moroccans or Senegalese in France or the Pakistanis in England.
What should Israel do now vis-a-vis Turkey, and can Israel have relations with a future Kurdistan?
Israel has been helping the Kurds in Iraq from the very beginning. Israeli military advisors have been active with the Kurds for 20 years. Israeli-Kurdish relations remain excellent, and I hope they continue to remain excellent. There's very little that Israel can do with the Turks right now because Turkey is supporting Hamas, giving Hamas a base, supporting ISIS and other elements who are irreconcilable with Israel's existence. Israeli-Turkish trade remains pretty strong. There are many ties between Israel and Turkish civil society and business. And the best thing Israel can do is maintain low-profile relations with Turkish businesses and individuals where that's possible. But at the diplomatic level, with Erdogan in his present rampage, I just don't see what the Israelis are supposed to be able to do. If the United States and the Russians and everyone else can't deal with Turkey, kind of hard for Israel to get any leverage.
What portion of the Egyptian economy does its tourist industry constitute, and how severely will tourism be affected by the Russian airliner disaster, and should we all be worried about it?
Well, tourist receipts at the top were about $11 billion a year. After the so-called Arab Spring, the overthrow of Mubarak, it went down to $5 or $6 billion. Tourist receipts are in the $6 billion range now. They will certainly be affected negatively, but the really decisive thing that's holding up the Egyptian economy is neither tourism nor the Suez Canal, it's remittances. The solidarity, let's say, of the Egyptians working abroad with their families at home. So although this is a significant blow to Egypt, the $1 billion or two which they might stand to lose in a worst-case development through shrinkage of tourism is not going to I should say, break the camel's back, but it won't be decisive for them.
Thank you, David. And just one more question from me. At a hearing recently, former Congressman Robert Wexler mentioned that one of the reasons, and this is a totally separate topic, but since you're a demographer, I wanted to ask you this. He said one of the reasons that Israel needs to make peace with the Palestinians is because the Palestinians are overpopulating the Jews in the area. And I was wondering what your opinion of that is.
Well, this has been a huge controversy. I think the facts are now overwhelming that the Jewish fertility rate between the river and the sea is at or even slightly higher than the Palestinian fertility rate, leaving out Gaza. So if you believe the demographers I follow, the excellent study was done by the Begin Sadat Center at Bar-Ilan University. The likelihood, there's simply not going to be any change in relative demographics for the next generation. It'll still be roughly 70-30 Jewish-Arab. The myth of a very high Palestinian fertility rate has been circulated since the Oslo Accords, and the idea of a demographic time bomb was one of the major motivations for this. It simply isn't true. Israel has a Jewish fertility rate of over 3, and if you take out the Haredi, the so-called non-religious or non-ultra-religious fertility rate is still 2.5, 2.6. Former Ambassador Joram Ettinger has written a good deal about this. I've written a good deal about this in the past. I think those numbers are completely wrong. The fact that the Jewish People's Policy Institute and a number of other organizations still continue to circulate the demographic argument in the face of overwhelming data to the contrary, in my view, reflects less an objective view of the demographics than a political standpoint, which finds it convenient to invent a demographic argument which justifies their presuppositions about what the political settlement should be.